Hello and welcome. I am Pavla Bergenwolf, class of 2018.
And I'm Emma Hanselman, also class of 2018. At Brandeis, we were art history majors and studied with Professor Scott, and we were especially impacted by her course covering the legacy of Georgia O'Keeffe.
For both of us, Professor Scott's mentorship has been long-lasting. In fact, it was Professor Scott's course on Georgia O'Keeffe that generated my enthusiasm for early American modernism, which led me to my current career at an American art gallery in New York City.
And for me, while working with Professor Scott during my senior year on an independent study of the artist Sonia Delaunay, I was made aware of the dedication, passion, and skill that she includes in all of her pursuits.
It is our pleasure to welcome you to today's Alumni College session, in which Professor Nancy Scott will discuss Georgia O'Keeffe, Art and Music, Suffrage and the Southwest, commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, protecting women's constitutional right to vote. Our session today is a tribute to this historic milestone and offers an opportunity to explore Georgia O'Keeffe's art during the suffrage movement and beyond. This topic feels even more so relevant given the continued fight for equality and against injustice in this country. We are delighted to have the opportunity to share this event with you, our alumni, parents, Brandeis National Committee members, and friends around the world. Thank you for joining us.
And now to introduce Professor Scott. Nancy Scott is Professor of Fine Arts at Brandeis. She received a Tyson Fellow Scholarship for the summer of 2019 at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. Her ongoing project illuminates the origins of O'Keeffe's philanthropy at Fisk University in 1949, where O'Keeffe donated 101 works of art of the Stieglitz collection. The artist also personally oversaw the installation at the historically Black university during the Jim Crow era, reprising a gesture of liberal philanthropy that recalls her early New York years of activism. Professor Scott earlier published a biography, Georgia O'Keeffe, Critical Lives, in 2015, published by Reaction Press, London. There she also references certain works of O'Keeffe that were once shown at Brandeis, when O'Keeffe won the Creative Arts Award here in 1963. The Stieglitz collection is today co-owned by Crystal Bridges and Fisk in a 2-year rotation. Thank you, Professor Scott.
I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to this virtual event, and I hope you're all settled somewhere comfortable and cool today. It's getting quite hot in Boston already. I am showing you first a Jimsonweed plant to symbolize one of the great flowers that O'Keeffe painted quite often. It's a work of art that I stumbled upon, a photographic work of art, you might say, and we'll see the painting that comes from this great flower later in the presentation. I want to start with the chancing upon the Jimsonweed because it's such a special and extraordinary flower, symbolizing to me in many ways the clashing elements that are a part of O'Keeffe's artistic personality, both beautiful and daring, both bold and also somewhat frightening. This is the plant actually that comes from the nightshade family and can be poisonous or can be used in native rituals, as it was in the Southwest, as a hallucinogenic. So there is this mix of forces that inform O'Keeffe's early life, and she is quite a radical young woman as she steps into art school in New York early in her career. Here's a kind of template for the lecture today. O'Keeffe, we're looking at art and music because music is very much an inspiration in her childhood, in her early education, and the music is going to be in the works of art, actually. So those two are bound together. An important category for our celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment is about suffrage, and I will demonstrate how her interest, she's not a suffragette, so strictly speaking, she is actually an artist who's very involved with friends who are interested in suffrage, and her reading and her activism comes through these friendships of her early days in New York. I'll explain that in a moment, and the Southwest will be the last section. with some touchstones along the way about this Brandeis involvement that Emma has so well explained to you already, which is great. So this is just a little capsule of key dates in O'Keeffe's early career, and then through to her death in 1986 at the age of 98. Of course, everything about O'Keeffe's life changes when she meets Alfred Stieglitz, and that is facilitated really by her dear friend Anita Politzer, who is the chief suffragette of this saga. Here are two very famous photo portraits of O'Keeffe by Stieglitz, one of which he makes of her when she first comes to see her Texas work exhibited at the 291 Gallery. She has on her traveling hat. She's taken the railroad all the way from the panhandle of Texas to New York City to see the exhibition in 1917 that he hung of her work. And on the right, you see a photo of her holding a sculpture by Henri Matisse, which indicates her very deep involvement in both a European art style that Stieglitz has been exhibiting in his 291 Gallery through the years from really 1909, 10, 11, which she would not have experienced firsthand, but she comes to New York by, well, 1908, actually. She sees the first Rodin drawing show. She does not see the Matisse show. She's back in New York in 1914-15 to study and receive her teacher training at Teachers College. And those years exposed her to Stieglitz's gallery, but the two of them really become entranced with one another when he sees her works of art for the first time. This is just a symbol of her training at the Art Students League, which was the first place she was allowed to go off to school in New York City. She had a very spotty artistic education, as you can see from the header on this particular image, studying first at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. This had to do with family finances, quite frankly, these large gaps in the years when she's not studying art. So between Art Students League and starting to study art again in the summer of 1912 at the University of Virginia, those are periods of the family's financial issues and also O'Keeffe's own illness. She had a very bad time of it, one disease, in fact, that could not be controlled and caused her to lose all of her hair and have to have a very long recuperation when the family had moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. And then she comes back and an aunt funds her time at Teachers College. So this is the middle period, that wonderful year at the Art Students League. And you can see how many men are here. This is the point of this image. There is the portrait of O'Keeffe, which was created by an artist named Eugene Speicher in 1908. And he said to her, "You have time to pose for me. I'm going to be famous someday." So I hope all of you who are out there will have a good hearty laugh over that one. This is the only woman who actually showed up for the reunion in 1950. Her name is Peggy Bacon. She was sometimes exhibited by Stieglitz and related galleries. This is Kuniyoshi, whom we can almost not see, very important Japanese American artist. So here is the first introduction to Anita Politzer. She is talking to W.J. Jameson. I meant to take out the senator. He's not a senator. I double checked that last night. He was the finance committee chair, actually, of the Democratic Party. It was the Democrats who were really pushing the vote for women. And it took a very long time before the vote was ratified, August of 1920, and it was Tennessee that pushed that vote over the edge. So Anita and Georgia creates her own caricature self-portrait on the left, writing to Anita. She called herself Patsy in those days. That's when she still had the curly hair. She's going to work like a tiger, and she writes these wonderful letters to Anita throughout the years 1915, 16, when they've been in school together in New York. They separate, and Anita starts to work very much as a foot soldier in the movement for suffrage. She writes to Georgia a lot. It's almost like a diary. And Patsy / Georgia, who's older and has a sort of big sister relationship with Anita, tells her how meaningful her art is coming to be during a time of isolation. She's teaching in South Carolina when she writes so much to Anita. Anita is going to march in the 1915 Fifth Avenue parade for suffrage and describes it all to O'Keeffe. So those are all letters that are wonderful traces of this early divergence of their interests, and yet at the same time, Anita will always be pulling Georgia closer and closer to advocacy for suffrage, but we would never call Georgia O'Keeffe a suffragette, okay? She's not marching, she is making art. And the senator from Tennessee who pushes it over the edge is named, by the way, Byrne. And his mother told him to vote for suffrage, and apparently he broke the vote just that way. So it was very, very narrow in the state of Tennessee in 1920. These things are so hard won. Women as World Builders. We actually have a copy of this book at the Brandeis Library in the original edition, and I was able to read it quite some time ago because I became interested in the O'Keeffe Pulitzer correspondence, which is housed at the Beinecke Library at Yale University, and I read through the entirety of the correspondence, wrote an article about it. This is, oh gosh, a long time ago in the 80s. And I read the books that O'Keeffe was reading. It became very interesting to me. I wanted you to see a separate cover because it gives the publication date of 1913 and the studies in modern feminism. Essentially what Floyd Dell did was to write a very ardent advocacy for women and their right to work outside the home. And you can see the quote from his book. Actually, I can't see it because it's hiding behind a lot of controls. But it is pursuing one's own ambition in life, and to do this with bravery. This is Floyd Dell's clarion call to women. Then he does a set of, I think there are about a dozen essays. The one that I particularly wanted to highlight is the Isadora Duncan essay, because he speaks about Isadora Duncan as the freest spirit in the freest body. And her dance, of course, completely reinvents American modern dance. O'Keeffe would very likely have seen at least one Duncan performance. I can't document this, but in the Stieglitz circle, other artists around Stieglitz, by the time O'Keeffe and Stieglitz become intimate, there is definitely a knowledge and a passion about Isadora Duncan's free dance postures, and those works of art are in the Stieglitz collection, some of them even at Fisk University in the gift with Crystal Bridges now shared. So to move ahead, O'Keeffe's free spirit moves towards abstraction. She becomes very interested in color, to put away her colors and to pursue charcoal abstractions in the fall of 1915. So we are now past her various years of spotty education, Teachers College having been the most recent. She is desperate to have a job, and she makes that very clear in letters to a young man, a political scientist, whom she was seeing at that time. His name was Arthur McMahon, and she writes to him that she's leaving for South Carolina, and when she does, he says, why are you sewing? You mentioned you're sewing. Well, of course, she's sewing her own clothing. This did not become publicly admired or known much about until just quite recently when Wanda Korn did a fabulous exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, and it came here to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, where we could see O'Keeffe's own handmade clothing in juxtaposition with many of her works of art. So to get back to that fall when she's sewing, busily having to leave New York, having to seek employment elsewhere, she gets down on the floor and makes her works of art from forms in her head. She goes completely past old master traditions or the study of art that comes before her and draws upon these interior sensations and emotions. One must say at the same time, she's seen a good deal of work on paper at the Stieglitz Gallery by this fall of 1915 because she's been in New York the prior year. And charcoals were shown by Picasso during the time, and Braque, by the time she was leaving New York. Those images might have been in her head. These are not Cubist, obviously, but these are works that draw upon a charcoal abstract tradition that she's been enmeshed with. Next, she has to go back to New York, and I will skip over all the details except to say she finishes teacher training but never graduates. And this is her portrait in the West Texas State yearbook called Le Mirage, and she is a teacher then in Texas till 2018. Texas is an amazing place for her, and this is a series now of her great watercolors, The Evening Star, which she does in a series of 6. Stieglitz loves all of this work, and of course, it is to him that Anita Politzer brings the charcoal abstractions first on New Year's Eve, the night of December 1915, and she writes O'Keeffe through the night, posts the letter the next morning to tell of Stieglitz's reaction. So Stieglitz learns about O'Keeffe's art first through Anita Politzer, and he is wowed by this body of work. So this is a Stieglitz self-portrait, and then the back view from the famous 291 gallery. So to continue with the Texas watercolors, this is Train at Night in the Desert, a series of 3, another wonderful one that really is all about the cloud of steam. But you can see she's out there at dark, and it turns out when we read the letters, she's been hiking in the Paladura Canyon. She loves the flatness, the plains, the sunsets. She has a room that faces east, so the sun comes up in her room every morning. But the reason she has gone out to meet the train, and the letters of O'Keeffe, which have been published now by Sarah Greenow, the editor, great photography art historian at the National Gallery. It's Claudia, her little sister, 17 years old, who's on that train, who's coming to live with O'Keeffe. That's part of the O'Keeffe story we never hear so much about. And again, the family's poverty, due to a number of financial reversals, has ended with their mother dying of tuberculosis. So Claudia is the youngest sister, as I say, just 17. She takes the teacher training course. She will later establish a Montessori school in Los Angeles and run that for many years. This is O'Keeffe out hiking. So when you see that Paladura Canyon picture hot in its lava-like forms, imagine hiking in a white cotton crisp dress, undoubtedly that she made herself. So Claudia and Georgia, the oldest and youngest of 5 sisters. There were 7 children in the family in total. Light coming on the plains. Again, Texas watercolors. This is a series of 3. All of them are at the Fort Worth Museum, the Amon Carter. And she speaks specifically more and more to Stieglitz in the letters that flow from the Texas period, and fewer go to Anita Politzer. This one, she writes a very beautiful passage about looking at the light that comes on the plains and seeing it as not nothing, which people say is nothing. She chides them for this. She says, this is the most important thing, where the light just begins to emerge. You can see she's left the paper blank between the orb of light that's just gradually starting to emanate in this great form above the land of the flat prairie. So that becomes a place, a liminal place for her to enter into further artistic exploration. So here's her first exhibit that's just her own. He has given her previously in 1916 a tiny exhibit with 2 other men, and that's called An Exploration from a quote unquote psychoanalytic point of view. So he's still puzzled by the early work. This is the Paladura Canyon there. You can see some of the paintings are the Blue series, which are from Virginia. This is the charcoal study for Train at Night in the Desert. So that precedes the watercolor you just saw. That's the first painting she ever sells. And that is sold for $100. This, which you saw, may echo the music of her love of fiddle playing, and she talks about scraping away on the violin. But you can see here it's partnered with a work of art that she regarded as a mourning figure, i.e. bereavement after her mother's death. Stieglitz, of course, regarded it as a phallic symbol and gave it abstract names such as abstraction and reinvention, something along those lines. But you can see he's posing the works in a kind of provocative yin and yang partnership there. She never wanted to show the work, and she wouldn't tell him anything of its origins. So here we have the intimate period of their friendship developing. First, he photographs her in front of the works and in the gallery. This is her traveling costume again, a white starch linen collar that she's made herself that can be used and reused, but it's her hands that are so beautiful. He sees those as the hands of the creator. By 1918, when they are completely madly in love, and her former political scientist friend has been thrown over, she poses for him in a little attic studio that they share in the brownstone owned by his brother, Dr. Lee Stieglitz. And the attic has been given to O'Keeffe as a place to come back from Texas to recuperate from the dread pneumonia that she had suffered earlier that year. Of course, these were intimate exchanges and posing that she did for her lover, the photographer, but he chooses in 1921 to show only 1 week of a demonstration of portraiture, which included 140 works. It was meant to show his own revitalization, but of course he decides to exhibit some works of O'Keeffe, and she becomes what was known at the time as a scandal in New York. And in fact, people said about her, the Mona Lisa only got 1 portrait, O'Keeffe got 100. So then she has to deal with this interpretation of the work. This is the pink and blue on the right, the green and blue music, which are definitely her own responses to musical tones and shapes that she senses, as she likes to write about that. But the critics just have a wonderful time piling on these works and making all kinds of outsized and rather ludicrous determinations about what the work might mean. And of course, to the male critics, it means sex, sex, sex. And we know there is a libidinal and very voluptuous or sensuous quality to O'Keeffe's approach to painting. That's one reason it's still so beloved. It is a woman's point of view, but she certainly never intended them. There's a kind of strange dichotomy in her personality. She's both extremely severe and very puritanical, one might say, in certain ways, always dressing in black. But on the other hand, there's this sensuous rendering as well. But the male critics really give her quite, what shall we say, the kind of fame that one would never want. I have found this in an old Vanity Fair issue from 1922, and you can see O'Keeffe is at the top of these 6 women, and you can see the full title below. I hope the female of the species achieves a new deadliness. There is no author on this page, but I suspect strongly it was Paul Rosenfeld, a very close, intimate friend and critic who knew Stieglitz. The poem title, by the way, comes from Rudyard Kipling and has to do with the jungle, literally, but it is transposed here by Rosenfeld, who worked for Vanity Fair, who had an editorial role, and who writes another column, a long one, about O'Keeffe later in 1922 to promote her work prior to her first gallery show with Stieglitz. So in these years between her 1918 arrival in New York and her 1923 gallery show, there is a great deal of what we might say is scandalous publicity that starts primarily with the 1921 demonstration portraiture. And you see that the traveling hat, the Pelladura Canyon, that's O'Keeffe as represented here at the top of the page. And if you could read the entire text, and since you're at your own computer, you may be able to see some of it. It does describe in the last paragraph that it's Stieglitz who has helped her and helped her to become the quote unquote life giver. Okay, that's at the end of that paragraph. The other important people here I just wanted to point to are Marguerite Zorak, whose husband William Zorak is a well-known sculptor and intimate of the Stieglitz Gallery. She had a really great career getting started, but then a very rough time as she raised a family and was married to an artist. But Zorak is really coming back in recent years. And this is Ilonka Karaj. And this is a woman who, this is a woman, sorry about this. This is a woman who is one of the most important New Yorker cover artists, and she gets her first job at the New Yorker in 1924. And I was so pleased to see her decorative silver work at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston for this very important show, Women Take the Floor. So for the first time I saw actual objects of courage, and here she is, otherwise almost forgotten, in a 1922 issue of Vanity Fair. To return to Suffrage images and to thread in our friend Anita Politzer back into the sections of this talk. Here is Anita, the only young woman amongst a group of women who seem to be quite serious dowagers, one might say. And Anita's holding her hat. She looks like a breath of fresh air, doesn't she? And Alice Paul, to the far left, is the president of the National Women's Party. I captured this from an entry about Anita on the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. She was from Charleston, South Carolina, and a lifelong friend of O'Keeffe's. So these women are the women who actually write the ERA. If you did not know, the ERA goes all the way back to 1923. It was the work of Alice Paul. They called the Right for Women to Vote the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and so the ERA was then called the Lucretia Mott Amendment. I've just talked to a lot of people about this lately, and I'm surprised that many people don't know how long ago the ERA was actually brought forward. And as you can see, it took until 1972 with second wave feminism for the Congress to pass the law. Gerald Ford and Betty Ford in particular were very strong advocates to get it ratified. And as you may know, it didn't get past 35 states when suddenly Ronald Reagan becomes president. And at that point in the shift of power to the Republican Party in 1980, it has taken years for the ERA to become ratified. It was ratified by the blue state of Virginia in the beginning of this year. But even Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said, it's not applicable any longer because the timeline has expired. Stay tuned. Let's hope it does finally get to ratification. O'Keeffe, during these years, as the Depression begins, will debate the importance of art. And she's very simple and plain spoken in her words, but she's speaking with a socialist, Michael Gold, who's the editor of The Masses. And I must say, she read The Masses when she was a young woman, also reading Women as World Builders and other works that came her way, like essays by Charlotte Gilman Perkins. All of that was in her early New York history. And here she's really trying to stand up for the continuing importance and influence of art. So I show, against that newspaper photo from 1930, a recent work of her fabulous calla lilies, which exist in many variations on the calla, but this one is in a private collection in Massachusetts. So I've been very fortunate to be able to study it on a couple of occasions. I'm very grateful to the people who allowed me to do this. And this is simply a wonderful, wonderful, big, engrossing calla. And as one art historian, Barbara Lyons, has suggested, she's sticking out her tongue at the critics. She's really had it by this point. And so I must keep moving, but there's a lot of just rich and wonderful painting in this particular work of art, and it's not just about the joke. The LK refers to a specific critic named Kalonime, who wrote outrageous interpretations of her art. What else is new? Similarly, the calla lily has been very much, diagnosed, as has been the Jack in the Pulpit. I had to put in a Jack in the Pulpit today because they're growing in the town forest, which is about the only place I go these days. And I wanted to show you what I spotted. This was in a wonderful exhibit of Stettheimer, Zorach, O'Keeffe, and Helen Torr, which was in Portland, Maine, a couple of summers ago. You see that little glint of a detail? Doesn't it look exactly like the profile of O'Keeffe holding the calla lily? This is her first New Yorker profile logo, and the drawing was done by a brilliant Mexican caricaturist, Miguel Covarrubias. So just to say, those calla lilies, those Jack in the Pulpit paintings come along at a very rough time in the Stieglitz-O'Keeffe relationship and may very well in many ways suggest her own private messages to Stieglitz. But she goes larger. And of course, these are works that will be very well known in the galleries and the annual exhibitions that he gives her from that first rough start in 1923. To return to the Jemison weed, this is very famous now simply because of its price. That should not be the only reason we look at the painting, but it is the highest prize ever achieved at auction by a woman artist. I hope there are other breaking news items in future years, but just to say there ought to be a level playing field, and it was hard won in the case of O'Keeffe's paintings. This was purchased by Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and has been much on tour since that acquisition. I photographed this as part of an exhibit called Nature's Nation, which was at Crystal Bridges while I was there last summer. The Radiator Building is another shift. Now we'll move away from Suffrage and into a little bit more about Fisk and Crystal Bridges. The Radiator Building was O'Keeffe's desire to paint architecture. Stieglitz didn't like this idea. He told her better to stick with the flowers. And because I want to be sure that I don't take up too much time talking and I get to hear from you, I will go through these next images rather quickly, but you will see the Radiator Building in all the images. This was her big success with making a strong and dominant image of one of New York's new skyscrapers. And she and Stieglitz lived in a New York skyscraper that was all new at the time. It was called the Shelton. This red neon sign here in the backdrop, which would be a sign flickering down Fifth Avenue. You're looking at 40th Street in Manhattan alongside the New York Public Library. This building is called the Radiator Building, as the title. Architect is Raymond Hood, and it was the first Art Deco skyscraper, but this neon sign has been repainted. Instead of saying Scientific American, it says Alfred Stieglitz. So it's a kind of homage to Stieglitz to get him on board with her architecture paintings, and this painting will go to Fisk University. When O'Keeffe makes the decision to divide the Stieglitz estate after his death in 1949, she donates the Radiator Building with that 101 selection group of photographs, watercolors, and oils. And I wanted particularly to show you the installation at Crystal Bridges just last summer, picturing modern America, because an Elsie Driggs painting of the very same year, 27, was purchased recently by Crystal Bridges. And this is a young woman full of talent and aspiration who even had the chance to travel in Italy and study Piero della Francesca, and yet her career went nowhere after a very active and important period of precisionist painting. And of course, O'Keeffe just does have the good fortune that her work just keeps going and going. And this is the Radiator Building at Fisk in 2016. I had a brief fall 2017 where I was able to do an exchange with Fisk, and the curator from Fisk University's gallery came to Brandeis and gave a lecture about a very important Nigerian artist, now deceased, Ben Emwamu, who is in the Fisk collection. And I went to Fisk and spent a bit of time in Nashville and gave a lecture to their students and faculty about my interest in O'Keeffe and Fisk, and also some of the underlying reasons I think she was drawn to give the work to Fisk. This is the installation that she personally supervised. That wall behind the African mask is blue. These walls were white. She got all the walls repainted, ceiling lights lowered, and she's essentially telling a story of the important African art that Stieglitz showed at his gallery in 1914-15, and then the works he collected from Picasso, Cézanne. We think this work is a Diego Rivera. This is a little harder to see. And then the growth of American modernism. We're almost 99% sure this is an Arthur Dove called Swingin' in the Park. The important people here are Aaron Douglas, who was the leading artist, head of the art department at Fisk. This is Pearl Cresswell, who was the director of the gallery, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in the 90s. A wonderful woman and a fabulous historical guide to knowing more about Fisk. And this is one of the students at Fisk. So O'Keeffe was there in the middle of the Jim Crow era. Emma gave a great introduction. Thank you. I don't have to tell you all of that. And here to go back to the issues of race and public issues that are still with us horribly, I must say, at the current time. This is a stamp that was not created until 1998, because at the time that this event happened, Eleanor Roosevelt was horribly slimed by press and many critics because she had dared to take a flower from an African-American child. Imagine. And this just tells you how hard it was to be a woman who would give away over 100 works of art to a Black university in the southeast part of the United States. Well, O'Keeffe's reason was quite simple. She said, I knew that if the Black students didn't have their own museum, they would not be allowed into the white museums. That's how bad Jim Crow was in that era. And it was her scope of radicalism, really, that allowed her to make the gift. And it's her scope of radicalism that tells us that she's also still fighting for the ERA, and I have the quote there for you. Okay, so it's time for me to wrap up. O'Keeffe receives the important medallion, which is our highest award to artists, or it's done differently now, but when we used to have the annual Creative Arts Awards, she received it at the Waldorf Astoria. There was an exhibit, and then she also had work exhibited in a show profiling American modernism in a very intelligent, very careful way that Sam Hunter put together. This is at the Rose, where we have the collector's room by Mark Dion currently installed. You can pull out a drawer and see all of these old catalogs. So American modernism contained O'Keeffe paintings, and so did Boston Collects. Just thought you'd be interested in seeing this wonderful array of everything going on at the Rose in the 60s. We have a CV that O'Keeffe sent to Brandeis when she was told she would receive she'd been selected. She agreed, of course, to come to New York. And it was a very big affair because the Ford Foundation had given Brandeis a huge gift that year. Just to say one more word here, you can see that this is a Hans Hofmann catalog. Buckminster Fuller is being shown also, along with Paolo Sileri. So there's just so much going on at Brandeis in the 60s when we're just such a new place. And this is, to go back to the resume, a one-page resume. How many people submit a one-page resume? And mostly what she focuses on is her travels. O'Keeffe did not start traveling till her 60s. She sends Brandeis a Christmas card. So here is Greetings of the Season, and it's one of her Texas watercolors imprinted on a large scale format card. I thought that was so charming. And then she exhibits these works with us. These two at the Rose and The Light Coming on the Plains, which you saw previously, all were at the Rose in '63 as part of that American modernism, trying to establish roots that were later much disregarded by the abstract expressionism movement, I must say. And then in the AFA gallery show, I'm showing you here abstract works, one very much inspired by the clouds and light on the plains, this one by the Gaspé Peninsula trip she took. And then this one is quite important. She also loaned a trial balloon effort of her first Sky Above Clouds painting. This is about 4 feet wide, and it remained in the permanent collection. As you can see, it's now at the O'Keeffe Museum. But this painting grew to be the great 24-foot-long mural that is today in the Chicago Art Institute. And this last painting was owned by Boston collectors, now in the Brooklyn Museum, Ram's skull with white hollyhock. So that brings us to the skulls. These two you may not think of as a pairing, but they definitely are. This was the cover of her very important 1976 book, which was her autobiography, more images than text. And it's, in a sense, a meditation on death and transcendence. And I think that what I was saying at the beginning about the Jimson weed and its shifting valences comes back when she is so enamored of making these sculptural bones into paintings. At Brandeis, we do have a very rich collection of Native American arts, which I've been able to teach from, but this also allows me to show you the antlers, the deer's antlers that were part of a specific ritual dance. And that also may have given her the notion of seeing the antlers swaying and moving in the dance-like space. Remember, she has a very musical side in her history and in her family as well. So imagine this dancer in motion, like the antlers float above the landscape. This is the most famous of the antlers from the faraway nearby, and that's what she called her land, so to say, the land so sere, S-E-R-E, sere, and unpopulated that she loved so much, looking out from Ghost Ranch, where the geology is extraordinary. You can see rocks back to the Jurassic and Cretaceous period at Ghost Ranch. Goat's horn from the same period. And then she gets into painting the pelvis bone. She has lots of friends on Ghost Ranch who bring her bones, the cowboys, the ranchers, and the Pedernal becomes her site of meditation, of a sense of linking herself to the earth. You can just barely see a shadow here, sort of beige pink tone. She found the shape of a leaping deer within that mountain. Her Ghost Ranch house faced the flat-topped Pedernal, which is quite distant from the ranch, but clearly visible anywhere on the horizon. So the pelvis becomes like Flying Victory sort of shape. There's one that's really like the Flying Victory, even more than this, but she sees them undulating almost in the same way she paints the flowers. This one is in Indianapolis. I used this one in my book. I was very taken with this. Pelvis with distance. And so I decided to end a little early in her career, but you're free to ask me lots of questions. She continues painting a lot in the 50s, but more she comes back in the 60s. She's on the cover of Art Forum in 1966. Her important profile piece is in Life magazine. She's on the cover of Life magazine in 1968. And she gathers young people around her at her house in Abiquiu. That's her second home, which was rehabbed and inhabited after 1945. But the Pedernal remains this abiding presence for her. So I am very taken with this work. It's a pastel, a large pastel, which to me reflects the end of World War II. She was only 70 miles away from Los Alamos. She certainly knew what was going on, even though it was not officially known, because there were certain German scientists who often were coming to Ghost Ranch under assumed names and were given leave to come shelter at the ranch and get a little R&R. So I think of this as a sign of her melding of the bones, the landscape, these simple motifs that she repeats and yet rebuilds into new meanings and new significance. And of course, she's one in a kind. And as she also liked to say, I'm a lone person. So this is a body of work that is not about portraiture, but about the self's projection into the world. So I'll stop there for now and take questions. I did want to just briefly say that my book is available on Kindle. If anybody is interested, I have a screen that describes a little bit about the book. It did come out 5 years ago though, so somebody else needs to take over now so that I'll stop talking and give you time for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Scott. We have some questions that are coming in, and again, for anyone participating in the webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to include them in the Q&A section of the Zoom window. First question here for Professor Scott. What was the motivation for Georgia O'Keeffe giving herself the name Patsy? Do we know about this?
Well, she was Irish in one way, and then she was Hungarian in another. She has a very mixed family history. Her grandfather, George Totto O'Keeffe, is, in a sense, she's the namesake of George Totto O'Keeffe. But her father was Irish, and I think there was a whimsy about using that more Irish sounding name, and she might have been teased about it. But later in life, she would say in an interview with Andy Warhol, no less, oh, we thought of ourselves as Hungarian. So that's the best I can do on that, the Irish side. Her father's name is Frank O'Keeffe.
Next question. Do we know why she was so taken with the pelvis bone and skulls? And also, did she see her art as sexual?
Well, she always denied that the work was sexual. In fact, there are many famous statements, especially about the flowers. Others see these meanings in my flowers, but I do not. And she talks a lot about looking into the heart of the flower and saying, take time to see. She really wants her audience to slow down. And I've made lots and lots of photos of the centers of flowers, just looking for that very point. Flowers in and of themselves, if you really look at them, yes, they are sexy. To go back to the other question about the skulls and the pelvis, these are objects that were very abundantly available on the desert around Ghost Ranch because there'd been a horrible drought. And the owner of Ghost Ranch, a man named Arthur Pack, also was trying to repopulate the terrain. He brought in antelope from, I believe, Montana. He was a very wealthy person, but maintained this ranch during those years. And so I believe that it has both to do with the Depression, literally the Depression with a capital D, and also her life is very difficult in the 30s. After she paints that white flower of 1932, she herself suffers a deep period of depression, and she essentially admits herself to Doctors Hospital in New York and takes a very, very, very long time to recuperate from that period of depression. She stops painting altogether, and it takes until from late 1932 into early 1934, she simply doesn't pick up brush or pencil. But events change, and she gets her old spirit back again, and it has very much to do with a certain person who reanimates her, Gene Toomer, the novelist, an African-American man who was in the Stieglitz Circle. He wrote novels, very famous for the novel Cain from the 1920s, but later he becomes a spiritualist. Now I'm going a long way from pelvis, bones, and skulls, but I think I'm trying to just reflect the idea that O'Keeffe had been through a lot that caused her to become a very armored sort of individual and to protect her privacy dearly. And those skulls and pelvis bones somehow reflect that austerity. I think they do speak to that shift in her life. But she would have probably said, I found the bones were very interesting.
A question here, acknowledging the incredible feminine natural beauty of much of her work, as well as the strength of her architectural paintings, do you nevertheless think it was O'Keeffe's relationship with Stieglitz that explains her enormous successes when contrasted with other female artists?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I mean, she would definitely resist thinking that it was all about him because she was the one doing all the work, but it was all about him in certain ways. It's just so fortunate that she made such powerful connections to the art world through Stieglitz. And as she herself later commented in an ABC News interview with her when she was 90 years old, she said there was nowhere else to go to see great art in Manhattan, art that was modern and radical. There was nowhere else to go but Stieglitz's gallery. It was just, he was trying out everything new. He was very open to everything that was new. And then that network, of course, I mean, think of how many times in a person's life, the right mentor, the right patronage can really make the difference between making work and not making work, or getting ahead. But of course, to go back to her own feelings about this, she worked very hard, and she exhibited continuously in Stieglitz's gallery between 1923 and 1946, the year of his death. So she had talent, but would it have been realized in the same way? Question mark. Okay.
I have a question here about her pottery work. Could you speak to any of that?
Well, that became a passion that she was trying out in her late life. So this is when she has the young people around her in the 70s, and a particular young man, Juan Hamilton, works his way into her inner circle, and he starts making pottery. He was a potter. She's losing her eyesight at the age of 85. She's already 85 years old, you see, by 1972, 3, along in there. 4. In those years, she's experiencing gradual macular degeneration. She has some kind of event, probably an optic nerve stroke of some sort, but it wasn't described as such, that causes her to lose the center of field vision in one eye, and then it just goes on from there. And she dies in 1986, the age of 98. So the pottery is a tactile and wonderful way to explore the shapes that she's painted. And Juan Hamilton is already doing that kind of work in his studio, so he helps her. He gets important shows in New York during those years. And I think it was a great thing for her to be able to do in those years.
Professor Peter Kalb says, thanks for the presentation, and is curious to know if there was any contact between Elsie Driggs and Georgia O'Keeffe.
Oh, great question. I'm sorry, I don't know of any. I've not come across that. I mean, they've been paired in precisionism shows, but no. Ask Professor Kalb to tell me if he's ever come across them in the same coterie of friends. But I've never seen her name mentioned in any of the O'Keeffe letters or that sort of thing.
We have a question inquiring about her, her pursuit of financial success. Did she care about financial success over and above or separate from her artistic successes?
Well, I think that it was very important to her, yes. Some scholars in the O'Keeffe world have argued with me on this point and have said her marriage was more important to her than anything. And when the marriage with Stieglitz appeared to be threatened in the early 30s, and that was part of what triggered the Deep Depression, his affair with another woman, Dorothy Norman, it may well be that the marriage was, above all else, the important thing over money. But money mattered because her family had had such disastrous and precipitous collapse, because they were wealthy while they were dairy farmers in Wisconsin, or wealthy, so to say. They had the land and the riches of the land. When the family moved to Virginia, there was just a steady failure that the father couldn't adapt to new ways of life, new business. And I think at least several of the family members were devoted to making sure they did well in life. One of them married well, that was her sister Anita. And Anita had fabulous wealth during her lifetime due to her husband's job as head of Pennsylvania Railroad. And O'Keeffe, I think it mattered to her to be able to sell the art, yes. I think that was very important to her. And when Stieglitz seemed to fail her, she wanted to go find other avenues to making her own deals with other people. She did occasionally show her work with Edith Halpert, even before she stopped, or ceased to exhibit in the Stieglitz Gallery, which stopped in 46.
We have a question here about Georgia O'Keeffe's views on women's rights and how they evolved over time. Could you speak to that?
Sure. So she actually is not a person we would call a suffragette. She did not like being called a woman artist either. She wanted to be remembered as a great artist, not as a woman artist. Nonetheless, her friendship with Anita continued through the years. In the 1940s, 1945, Anita is promoted. She is the youngest of that first generation, as you can see, in the National Women's Party. So she's the leader of the National Women's Party by the mid-40s, and she urges O'Keeffe continually to lend her name to support of the party, apart from dressing down Eleanor Roosevelt in that letter I showed and saying, I feel that we are half the people. It's part of that letter if we don't pass the ERA. O'Keeffe will be encouraged by Anita to attend conferences, to give her face and name to publicity about the Women's Party, to keep the ERA movement going. There are letters exchanged with Malvina Hoffman, the sculptor, and O'Keeffe, to whom she had to write several times to get Malvina Hoffman to add her name to the Women's Party roster. So there's an actual laughing O'Keeffe who's depicted in a photograph of the National Women's, let's see, her group is called the Advisory Committee. So it does continue. And by the way, I owe this richness of later 1940s, 50s interest on O'Keeffe's part to Linda Grasso, who wrote a very good book called Equal Under the Sky. It was published in 2017. So if anyone's interested strictly in the feminist side of O'Keeffe, this book has it. It's really a very informative, important addition to the field.
We have a question here. Was Georgia O'Keeffe influenced by other artists of her time, or was she more kind of directed, self-directed in her artwork?
Okay, that's also complicated. She herself would say in a 1962 interview with a curator at the Chicago Art Institute that it was Chinese art that primarily influenced her abstraction and her interest in certain ways of painting. But frankly, if one looks back at her early career and what she read, she was very engaged by writings about Cézanne, for example. She prepared a lecture for her fellow teachers at West Texas State College in Canyon, Texas, and she was reading Willard Wright. She was reading parts of Clive Bell, the British theorist, book on art. That would have been all about European modernism, those early books that were published before 1918. But she doesn't really pattern her art on a specific artist style in so much as she's continually saying she draws on forms in her head, almost as if she has a kind of communion with the self and begins to draw, and to draw with a great deal of extension of the arm and physical force against the paper. That's the charcoals in particular. She does those on the floor. She paints on the floor long before Jackson Pollock ever thinks about dripping paint onto the canvas, okay? So it is somewhat self-directed. I think she's very influenced by things she sees at the Stieglitz galleries for sure. The Rodin drawings that I mentioned that she sees in 1908 seem to have influenced some of her drawing style, but it's still quite different. I think she really loved the Brancusi sculpture, no doubt, that she would have seen that was in the Stieglitz gallery that winter she was in New York at Teachers College. She was very good at picking out works of art that she admired to go to the right museums when she divides up the Stieglitz collection. She did that with extreme care and caution. That's what I spent a lot of my time studying while I was at Crystal Bridges, looking across institutions. And she puts the European and the American works into all the major contexts, which include Fisk. They all get a mix. So that means she doesn't not look at European art. I hope that's not too long an answer. But I think her main force is that early work that she would have seen in New York, plus always trying to turn inward and create abstraction from within her own head. And yet she would always say, it has to be real and yet good in the abstract sense. So there you have the real Pedernal, but everything else around it is abstract.
We have a comment and question here from Professor Ada Wong. I'll just read it verbatim. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, Nancy. I'm quite taken with the Radiator Building, which is not her usual repertoire, as you pointed out. Would you say more about its style, poster, and Art Deco aesthetic and its reception at the time? The idea that male/female can be extended to the urban-nature dichotomy, and how this was something that she rejected, that preserving as a stereotype. What do you think were her feelings about this, and your sense of Stieglitz pushing her to keep painting flowers?
Well, great question, Naida. Thank you so much. And it's quite a multi-layered question. I was trying to jot down some of the points. Well, I will say this. First of all, she painted over 30 skyscraper paintings in Manhattan during these years in the late 20s. So once she got going, it was a burst of energy to show she could paint like the men. It was very avowedly, I think this is part of what Professor Wang is asking me. Yes, she goes for the Art Deco because it is the style of the period. She loves things that are modern and new, and it's a kind of radical architecture for New York at that time. Rockefeller Center is also rising in the early 30s, and Stieglitz photographs those buildings, and of course O'Keeffe wants to paint them as well. She paints a huge mural scale Manhattan that is actually a translation of the center building of 30 Rock. So she was very, very upset to be segregated to the flowers, associated with the feminine, and to be dissuaded that no, she could not be painting skyscrapers. It was very important to her to prove it. Now, does that go through her entire later life? No. It's a very specific period of that early Depression era precisionism. And she didn't like being labeled with any ism, by the way, so she didn't say that she was one of the precisionists, but clearly this is the moment for that style in her art to be most closely affiliated with precisionism. Could you just read me that last part of her question? I'm not sure I answered everything that was posed.
She was, yes, so you touched on the push from Stieglitz pushing her to keep on painting flowers, and I think the note you're referring to is the idea that male/female can be extended to the urban-nature dichotomy, and if this was something that she rejected.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did reject that male-female dichotomy. Yeah. And she did receive a lot of attention by the early 40s. She received her first honorary degree in the late 1930s, and then 1943 was a huge year. Chicago Art Institute gave her a huge one-person retrospective, and one of her most faithful admirers was a man named Daniel Catton Rich, and he became a friend and a lifelong supporter of O'Keeffe. He was somebody who really got her. In fact, we know because of the Brandeis archives that he wrote on her behalf when she received the Creative Arts Award. So that 1943 show just re-energized her, and she's not painting skyscrapers then. She starts to paint the bones and the Black Place and the White Place, those other desert locales.
So we have time for just one more question, and you just spoke about the connection again between O'Keeffe and Brandeis. Ingrid Shore asks, are there photos of O'Keeffe at Brandeis perhaps at the 1963 Rose exhibition, and can you speak a bit more about the O'Keeffe-Brandeis connection?
Sure. Thanks, Ingrid. The fact is she never came to campus. She sent her works to the Rose Art Museum, and she also did not accept the Creative Arts Awards at Brandeis because it was such a big deal that year because of the large donation from the Ford Foundation, which was, I think, $6 million, and it was a matching grant or something like that. So this was held in the Waldorf Astoria. That was where O'Keeffe was headed when she said she would happily come to the ceremony. She was going to New York. In fact, her sister had an apartment upstairs in the Waldorf Astoria. That was the wealthy sister. So no, sorry, we have looked and looked and looked in the archives for a photo of O'Keeffe on campus. There is none that we've been able to find. And there are not even photos that I've been able to find of the Waldorf Astoria event. And it's so sad that we don't have it because Leonard Bernstein was the MC. We have the transcript of his talk that night and how he honors each of the individual candidates. I should also tell you, though, a story that's in the archives. O'Keeffe writes a note to the woman with whom she's corresponding at Brandeis, the dean's executive secretary. She says, I want to return my $1,500 and give it to the benefit of Brandeis. So she takes her prize money and says, let it be applied to a future artist. So And that takes us back to her interest in money. Was she interested in money? No, I think she was just doing very well by the 1960s. This is in her 70s. She's 75 years old when that happens. And she wants the money to go back to Brandeis. And don't forget, she had very deep sympathy for the Jewish community because, well, she'd lived with Stieglitz all of those years. And she really cared about us, I think. And the work that would come. The next person to get that award, by the way, was Mark Rothko.
Thank you, Professor Scott. We'll now pass things off to Emma and Pavla again to close us off with the program.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Scott. That was such an incredible program. And this really brings us back to our classroom days when we were students, which is such a pleasure.
Thank you.
And special thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're delighted to see so much of our Brandeis community members coming together to continue this lifelong learning.
We invite you to join us for our upcoming programs next week on June 11th with Professor Ben Gomez-Caceres on the topic of business of climate change, and on June 18th with Professors Rami Targoff and Ryan McKittrick, who will discuss the real women behind SITS, the wives of Henry VIII. We look forward to you joining us. Thank you.